just while we're getting the technical issues sorted out. Is that on? Microphone on? Yeah, okay. I'll just speak a little bit so that the translators can get used to my accent. It's something you pick up on an aeroplane when you travel. It's didn't have one in Australia. Yeah, so I'm getting the sense that they can hear it okay. Great, just coming up now. So thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you for that. This is the first of two presentations today. So some of the introduction that Yurtse just gave is very relevant for what I'm going to be talking about now, but also this afternoon. So it won't all be in one presentation. So you can see the title there. If it can happen in Singapore, can it happen everywhere else? Maybe. So it's a global analysis of thoroughbred racing today and its potential futures. And other people from other countries will give you a lot more specific detail about each country than what I am able to give. But before I begin, I'd just like to thank the organisers, Yurtse and Paula, and for all the other people. I didn't know any names. These slides were prepared over a week ago. I think they're dated now after being yesterday's presentation. But thank you for the invitation and the support in making this event possible. I did think carefully about coming to this sort of event in terms of what was the purpose of it, how was it going to be used, was it a genuine discussion? And I did look up Yurtse's profile and others to make sure. And I think it's really important that, as Yurtse said, to have this discussion. And it will be hard. It's hard for me, it's hard for everybody else, I understand. So I think that listening, that engagement. So I'm here to share some thoughts with you today, but also to learn. And I have been learning over the past few days as well. So just to begin, this is information from the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities, their last publicly available report, 2019. To give you an idea of the global perspective, they divide it into Asia, Americas, and European, and countries such as South Africa, for example, end up being in Asia, which geographically is not really where South Africa would see itself in the globe. But you can also see that there's a difference in the racing. Very few jumps races in Asia and Americas, much more so in European and Mediterranean countries. And as I said, I'll talk about that this afternoon. So what I want to talk about today, using the concept of scale and to go through different scales and things that you might have to react or might have to anticipate certain activities or certain things happening, but you might not have any control over them, through to other things where you might be able to control a lot more. So using the idea of scale from a global scale, we have a global horse racing industry. Shuttle stallions move between hemispheres, top horses chase prize money at big races. So we have a global industry, but it's not the same everywhere. It looks very different in different parts of the world, which means that the impacts of some of these things will play out differently depending upon the culture, the history, and the decisions that you make. So starting with some of the big issues, things that are beyond the control, things like economic conditions. If there's a global recession, it is going to affect horse racing. You can't control that, but it will mean less money for the horse racing, the price of yearlings will go down, all those sort of things. And there's a lag time. If the economy starts to pick up, it doesn't mean that horse racing picks up necessarily at the same pace. We all know about COVID-19, travel restrictions, war. You've experienced that. I don't need to say too much more. Again, beyond control, but very important. Technological change. Yesterday, we saw the drone taking footage of the racing. Who could have imagined 10 years ago that that would be the case? So, but it provides a different sort of experience for people to see the horse racing using the drone. But technological change can improve safety, but can also have many other impacts. One potential impact is the idea that you don't need horse racing. You don't need the physical horses. You can have what's called simulated horse racing as a gambling product. So you can watch horses on a television screen and bet on them without any real horses at all running. It's like cartoon horses. And that's important, that's a potential change. There's also changing economic power relations between countries. A country discovers some oil, they get very rich, they go buy horses because it's seen as status, so on. And the last two, animal welfare issues. There's a general trend, Yurtsi just talked about it, moving from things like slavery, the treatment of horses, other animals, but it will look differently in different countries. And then human or anthropogenic, human-made climate change. That is real, it is happening, but will again affect different places in different way. So Dennis may recognise a Danish king, King Canute. The idea that he was trying to hold back the sea. These are like these global issues. Supposedly, he wasn't really trying to hold back the tide. He was saying it's going to come in anyway, but we have to deal with it. So you can stand in there and get drown. You could move away and get your feet wet. You could move away or do something else and avoid get in a boat or something. You can do various things, but you cannot stop some of these global forces. But also, as I said, globally, it plays out very differently. So if we look at the industry, this is from the thoroughbred-only racetracks, not counting standard-bred harness racing racetracks. You can see in Australia, lots of them, 392. I think I saw Joel 382. It's 392. Ireland, only 26. But when we look at the other side from a report from Deloitte in 2023, the population, there's many more horses in Ireland per 10,000 people, and that relationship between horses and society is really different. If you look at America, lots of horses, lots of racetracks, but they're often stabled. People don't see horses every day. So that culture, that understanding of the human-horse relationship is really different between countries. And that's important in terms of the way how issues will play out. Just a few slides to show you. I mean, who would have thought a couple of generations ago we'd be having a Dubai World Cup, for example, or that Godolphin would be having stables in a place like Newmarket. They're big changes, and that's because of oil money. It's desert and sand, but underneath it was oil. Climate change, some photos I took in 2008 in Kentucky, Keeneland. You can't race in the winter, lots of snow. Who knows, climate change, winter starts later, finishes earlier. Maybe the racing season extends a little bit there, potentially. On the top right-hand side is a place called Worcester in England. It's sort of west country of England, not far from Birmingham. Racetracks are often built in low-lying areas because it's not suitable for other reasons for housing. So they're prone to flooding. So if you get more, a warmer atmosphere, more moisture in the atmosphere, when it rains, the rain is often heavier. That's what anthropogenic human-created climate change is doing, more intensity of rain. If you've got a low-lying racetrack, it's more prone to flooding. Okay, so that might mean you have less chance to have a race meeting. Worcester was also interesting. It also had to cancel races because of the heat. So they got both. The races were too hot and they had to cancel them. The last slide, the bottom there, an albino horse. You can see heat is a big issue. If climate change, what is happening, anthropogenic climate change, we cannot perhaps race horses as we used to. We might have to change the time of day, shorten the races, adjust, use more water. Japan, I've been told, air conditioning, lots of things that might be necessary if we want to continue horse racing. We cannot just do what we did before because the conditions have changed and are continuing to change. Just on that point, thinking about the water, we should think about recycling. That is probably, I suspect, drinking quality water, potable water being used to wash a horse. We don't need to do that. Maybe we need to have other water that's recycled, or that water could then be used to water the track, the grass afterwards. We need to think about the environmental impact of that, because in hot days, people are going to question, why are we using valuable, precious water for watering horses and for watering grass? If we talk about regionally, you may recognise, obviously here in Poland, in some places, the European Union, Brexit, very important. Less so in places like Australia or New Zealand, regional, but here, these sort of, and the pattern committee of where you have which races and when you have races, so they're not all competing with each other, is really crucial. In Australia, we have different states, and the people in Melbourne and the people in Sydney put big races on, millions of dollars to compete with each other. It's a bit silly. It's competitive, but they're trying to outdo each other. Here you have it more organised, but it does mean that sometimes some countries go up and other countries go down. If we think about the national level of different areas, the particular stance of particular governments, I mean, obviously, to take the extreme case, I guess, but very real, you've had communism in Poland, the industry was nationalised. That's changed, but that is an example of where the horse racing industry will look very different. It could be a change in government, one that's perhaps more sympathetic to the horse racing industry, one that might be more opposed to it. That's going to be really, really important, and it affects other things such as gambling legislation. Depending upon what the legislation, the laws are, that will potentially impact revenue in the industry. So in some countries, gambling is allowed on a whole lot of activities, so horse racing is competing with many other activities. In other countries, and I think Japan is an example, there are very few things you can gamble on. So the horse racing, if people want to gamble, is one of the few sports, along with, say, keirin bike racing and other things, that is available for gambling, which means it gets some money from the gambling. But also, nationally, the relationship to the thoroughbred breeding industry is important. Some countries have lots of breeding horses, so they race and they breed. Ireland, Ireland, Australia, but not places like Singapore or Hong Kong. No space, so they had to import horses from elsewhere. Again, the country, that makes a big difference. And finally, Dennis will talk about this. I won't talk anymore, but I do agree with what's happened, changes. Animal welfare issues, very visible. That's what people see. People who are not used to horses or understand riding horses, they see a horse being hit and they wonder why. That impacts the perception of the activity. In some cases, the state or the province in a place like Canada is really important. Okay, it's not the national level, it's actually much lower level, it's like the state. So in USA, they're called states, in Australia, they're called states, in Canada, they're called provinces. And that could affect things such as the gambling. So here's an example. I'm sure you've heard of racinos, racing casinos. In some states in America, there are no horse racing tracks and no casinos. Well, no racinos and no casinos. So California, for example, they have racing tracks, but they don't have a racing track with a casino attached, and they don't have casinos. In a place like Nevada, which is Las Vegas and Reno, they have 270 casinos and no racing tracks. A lot of casinos. In places like Florida and New York, no casinos, but some racinos. That is really important because it means that the horse racing is very much tied to gambling. The perception of horse racing is tied to gambling. It brings money into the industry, but potentially has animal welfare issues in terms of suddenly a lot of prize money for perhaps lower grade horses. It might tempt people, some trainers, to race their horses when they shouldn't, or drug the horses up or something, and the horses can get injured. So there have been problems with this. So again, at the level of the state, it is really important. And at the level of the city, this one I think is important for patronage, the urban dynamics, the land values, the accessibility. You have a racing track here that's owned by the city. That is important. It's not a privately owned racing track. I didn't know that before coming here. Accessibility, you have transport to it. Some tracks are very close to the city. They're old. They might be accessible for people, but not for the trainers and for the horses to come into if they're not on site. If the horses are not kept in boxes and stalls on site, then it's really hard for trainers to get their horses into the city because the city is expanded and there's lots of traffic and cars and they've got to take more time to get in. In terms of the tracks, I just want to go through a couple of examples for you. There's a few more I could add to the slide. As I said, I didn't change the slides so that the translators could see what I had here. What we see in some places where horse racing is stronger, there's more horse racing, is that you have more than one racetrack. And that's important, obviously, also for safety reasons, that the racetrack is more meetings, the track gets a chance to spell and to recover. So you sometimes have one or two main tracks, and you might have a smaller inner city track. So I've underlined the ones here. So, for example, in Hong Kong, you have Sha Tin, which is sort of on the outside, New Territories area, and then Happy Valley, the smaller track, close to the city centre, has midweek racing and night racing. In Sydney, we have what's called, it should be Royal Randwick, Rosehill Gardens, the big tracks. One called Warwick Farm and Canterbury Park, they do the same thing. Melbourne, similar example, 4 racetracks in the city, plus new ones outside beyond the city, but close. Flemington, where the Melbourne Cup is held, Caulfield, Sandown Park and Moonee Valley. So Sandown Park in the suburbs, Moonee Valley, fairly close to the city centre, midweek, late night racing. So people go to work, can go to the Friday night and then go home afterwards. So they're serving different things. Means you could have a lot of race meetings, but not overuse a particular track to make it dangerous for horses. Another example I haven't included here is in Perth in Western Australia. You have 2 tracks, plus they've built a new one outside. But the 2 tracks, one is used in winter, that's Belmont Park, and one is used in summer, which is Ascot. So different surfaces, different drainage, and chance to spell for about 6 months of the year. Sometimes there's a move to close one track. You could sell a bit of land at the track, but also maybe close the track. The land value is high, and use it to upgrade other facilities. So perhaps an old track that's not as good would cost a lot for maintenance. They can upgrade it. So here's an example, one that's a debate in Australia at the moment. It's called Sandown Park. It's in Melbourne. It's in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne. A bit hard to get to for some people in Melbourne. It has, let me see if I do this right, a car racing track around the outside, okay, but nothing in the middle. Just lake, it's a river lake, not very well used. The grandstand is away from the car racing track in between, quite distance from the horses, so the spectators don't like it, as it says here. Unpopular with racegoers, but loved by trainers and jockeys because the racetrack itself is considered a fair racetrack, a good racetrack. So the idea is that they want to sell it, but not everybody is happy about selling it. So to get to the point about Singapore, what are we looking at? We're looking at a city that's got very little land. There's no breeding because there's no land for horse breeding, but there's not even land for people to live very much. Singapore prides itself on being a green city, lots of trees, lots of vegetation, but it's lots of also housing population. And then you have a racetrack, lots of space. So it became vulnerable in that sense because you can do things like simulated gambling. You can watch races from Australia, from Hong Kong, from elsewhere, but when it comes to housing, you cannot live in a simulated house. You have to actually have a space for a bedroom, for sleeping, for toilets, for storage, etc. So this was a very real need, and the Singapore government, who owned the land, is effectively a one-party state in Singapore. They have elections, but that basically they announced the closure of this particular racecourse. So in this sense, it doesn't matter if you have lots of people in the grandstand. If you have a problem with space and the context, it means that, and the government owns it, they could close it, which is what is happening. It will have its final race meeting in October 2024 after 180 years of racing because the government wants that site for housing. Whereas you could have another case over here in the northwest of Western Australia. It's dry, you can see the track is dirt, which is unusual in Australia. Most tracks are grass, but this is too dry. Hardly any people, 4 horses racing, there's 11 horses I can see in the picture here. 4 horses racing, very small field, but it's continuing. It's been racing since 1867, probably not under as much threat as there. So again, it's not just about the size, it's more than that. So in terms of where do we move to the future scenarios from here, the various scales are linked. They're not separate. I've talked about scales as being global, regional, national, state, provincial, but they're linked, they're connected. And it depends upon whether global scale factors, such as animal welfare, climate change, will dominate local or state ones. Sometimes the ones such as Singapore, it is the local government, the context of housing issues that have become more important than animal welfare, climate change issues. So Some factors are unavoidable. Climate change and animal welfare concerns will happen at different pace, but they're happening everywhere and they'll impact differently. But you cannot avoid those sort of issues. Other factors are dependent upon various things, such as whether mineral is discovered, oil is discovered, political stability in some countries. If you have a revolution or something, the horse racing industry will be impacted, and it may be, example being Singapore, one of the biggest challenges will be for the Australian and the New Zealand breeding industries, because Singapore didn't have any land for breeding. It's a global industry. Australia and New Zealand were selling their horses into Singapore for racing. That will affect the breeding in Australia and New Zealand as much as anything else. So there will be change, and it will look differently in different places. And I think climate change and welfare concerns will play out differently, and it depends upon the culture. So if people are closer to horses, are used to seeing horses, that will look different than if people are very distant from horses. If horses are only seen on television screens, or maybe once every few years you might see a horse somewhere, then that's going to be very different in those countries. So the role of horse in society is going to be important. So it means, to conclude, if it happens in Singapore, it won't necessarily happen everywhere. It can look different in different places. Because Kranji Racecourse will close in October 2024 doesn't mean that horse racing will close everywhere. But some of the issues that happen in Singapore are relevant elsewhere. Singapore is unique, but other place embodies other pressures. So things like anthropogenic climate change are very real. They can't build housing in some parts of Singapore because it will flood, because it's so, etc. So there's not much land. The loss of social license due to animal welfare issues. Those issues are going to play out across the world, but it will vary depending upon the culture as to how much that is an issue. The availability of competing sources of entertainment and gambling options, or taxation revenue. So people in Singapore used to go to the races. Maybe in the future they'll watch racing on television from Hong Kong or from Australia or from England or South Africa. Maybe they gamble on other things, okay? But they have somewhere to live. Land pressures. How do facilities that occupy large areas, and horse racing tracks do, they possibly use lots of water, and that's going to be, in climate change, that water might not be available. And for what is seen as an elite group of people, a small group of people, often with money, how do you justify the existence when there's a lot of poor people, perhaps, or other people who can't afford to live in a house? It's a really strong argument that you have to make. Golf clubs face similar issues because they take up a lot of space, a lot of water, and not everybody plays golf. The other one in Australia has been bowling clubs, so lawn bowls. Some of those have closed in inner city locations and been turned into housing developments. So in that sense, the horse racing industry is not unique. Before coming here to Patronissa, I didn't realise your activities yesterday. There were so many activities. It was really great. I think, congratulations. It was very, very good to see a whole range of activities. It was use of the racecourse facilities, not just for horse racing on a few days of the year. And I think that's really, really important, really good. That is going to be crucial. So an example I was going to demonstrate, but you're already doing it, was Penfold Park in Hong Kong. Compare that use inside with the use I showed you of Sandown Park earlier in Australia, where it's just a lake and empty space. This gets used. There's little space in Hong Kong. Certainly in the city centre there is space outside the new territories, but people here very close can walk their dogs. It's like a green space in a city where there's lots of buildings packed close together. Very important for people, mental health, social, physical health. It's providing more than just a race course, particularly a race course for a few people who like to race their horses and for gambling. That's the sort of strength about this particular example. And it's also, I think, what applies here in your city as well. So it means that people leading horse racing organisations need to respond to changes where necessary and to be innovative where possible. And I'm pleased to see you're being innovative. Because the future is not predetermined. Individuals can make a difference. Organisations at that level can make a difference. You cannot stop climate change. You cannot stop animal welfare issues, but how you address them, how you respond to them, how you innovate is really important. That can be the difference between perhaps thriving, moving into the future, having a future, or if not responding to those issues, possibly it can mean decline. It can mean that those issues will overwhelm your horse racing industry, and that might potentially mean the end of the horse racing industry, but it's certainly not predetermined. And on that note, I'll say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.